Thanks, Frank. Thanks, everybody. It's great to see so many familiar faces from last time you were here when Jeremy D'Entremont was here. Helen, also, thank you for reaching out and inviting me to come. Get the projector set up and kind of get things going. You probably know that Lynn and I bought the Graves Light 2 years ago in a government auction, and we've been working on it ever since. It's been a real passion, a lot of exciting things to uncover and discover, and I think that it dovetails in with history, which everybody here is interested in, and it's I've always considered it to be a great book that's waiting to be read. So we've been digging through the history, and tonight is a presentation of just what we've uncovered. It's an ongoing show. This is the third time we've done it, and it keeps changing because people keep calling us, writing in, we keep finding more pictures and stories, so we keep adding to it, and it's getting kind of exciting. So, okay. So, this is a little show about the history, and then I'll talk about the renovation after that in another little quick show, and then we'll do any Q&A and questions that you have. So in the early days of Boston Harbor, there was a ledge, and it was called Graves. Can you go to the next slide, please? And it wasn't named after a place where bodies were buried. It was named after this well-fed man. His name was Vice Admiral Thomas Graves. And they don't think he was this big, but they painted them big to make them look wealthy, I think. But he was Governor Winthrop's admiral when Governor Winthrop sailed over here. And there's so many tie-ins to Winthrop that it's very exciting to give a presentation here to all you folks from Winthrop. He was a vice president in the Royal British Navy. He was the governor of Governor Winthrop's fleet. He is said to be America's first foreign trader and a resident of Lynn. Thomas Graves called the ledge the most dangerous reef on the coast. Sometime in the late 1870s or 1880s, a great whistling buoy was tethered to the extreme northern end of Graves Ledge. I have a little excerpt from the Globe. This is a photograph that we found of it before they put the lighthouse on it. And it's very rare because you just don't usually take pictures of a pile of rocks in the middle of the ocean. So it's kind of fun that we came across this. But I'll read you a quick excerpt from the Boston Globe that describes this whistling buoy, which I think is the next slide. Nope, I guess there's one after that. There we go. So, the lone sentinel is a fabric of steel plates with a mechanism so arranged that the billows, which heave it this way and that, force air through an aperture at the top, making the most weirdly mournful and blood-chilling sounds. That's great. An old sea dog on one of the harbor boats said that its sorrowings in bad weather, which touched every shade of grief from a weary, heartbreaking sigh to a terrifying, far-carrying shriek of despair, used to make him creepy with mind pictures of all the dead of all the years snatched from life by all the shipwrecks since the first finding of Boston Harbor. That was quite a mouthful. This fellow here is really the man most responsible for the building of Graves Light. This is Colonel William Stanton of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and he was the guy that was in charge of the magnificent structure. And he wrote a report that was so good after the Graves was built, because it was an engineering marvel based on Minet's light, a lot of the construction techniques. But Graves is a little bit bigger and more modern by about 40 or 50 years, I think. So I'm going to read to you excerpts from his report because it really, I couldn't do better myself. And this is the man that actually built it. He said, in the early days, the full-rigged ships, many of which were owned by merchants of Boston, had a draft of 16 feet. In the entrance channel to Nantasket Roads and the narrows to President Roads, the controlling depth was 23 feet at mean low water. For safety in approaching this old channel, Boston Light has marked it for 190 years. We got a slide of Boston Light? There we go. Many years of excavations to deepen the channel has brought only modest gains, and it was decided to open a new channel from President Roads to the sea at Broad Sound. There's another slide for that, I think, Lynn. There we go. This new channel at Broad Sound thus became the main entrance to Boston Harbor. For safety of approach, it became necessary to mark the other extremity of the tract by placing a light on its extreme northeasterly and outermost group of ledges known as the Graves. The ledge had a small apex awash at high water, but when cut down 4.5 feet, formed a sound bed for the entire first course of the tower. The tower is of granite and is 88 feet in height, consisting of 44 courses. Its diameter is 30 feet at the base. 3 feet above the highest recorded storm tide, the tower has a core of concrete and is solid except for 2 wells. One for water and the other one for steam to run the air compressors for the foghorn. The tower is built of 882 stones, the heaviest of which interlock and weigh 5 tons apiece, doweled together by iron pins. The interior space is 13 feet in diameter, lined with white enamel bricks and divided into stories. The first story is the landing and storeroom. This is a picture of about how we found it. And the interesting thing was we were trying to get insurance on it, and we called an insurance guy, and he said, well, is it an abandoned building or is it an occupied building? And I said, it's pretty much abandoned. He said, that's going to be tough to get insurance. And I said, well, what would make it an occupied building? He said, is there any furniture in it? And I said, yeah, there's a folding chair, actually. It's good enough. So that's how we got the cheaper policy. The next room is the second floor. It would have the fog signal plant with 2 semi-diesel steam engines. And you can imagine those running day and night. Would have been real nice. The third floor was the kitchen. The 4th and 5th floors were the bunk rooms. The 6th floor was the watch room, and that stands right on the granite deck, containing the pedestal and the clock and the revolving apparatus for the lens. And the 7th floor, of course, is the lantern room, which housed the first order Fresnel lens. It's perhaps the most important light north of Cape Cod at the time, and it was the most powerful light north of Cape Cod. This is a very, very rare shot of the U.S. Lighthouse Service plant in Chelsea. And they're making the stairs and a lot of the fittings for graves. That's where they made that. And they made all of the wood in their shop in Portland, Maine. The 5 stories in the tower itself are finished in quartered oak, built by the Lighthouse Service in Maine. By permission of the Lighthouse Board, it's a brand new piece of paper, so that's vessels were chartered without advertising, after a careful search of the ports of Boston and Portland with regard quite as much to the character, appearance, and qualifications of their masters as to the quality of the vessels themselves, as the daily conduct and progress of the work were too dependent upon the movements and handling of these vessels to trust the part they were to perform to any but alert and experienced and efficient masters, having the disposition as well as the ability to handle them at all times. It's written so well. They're really taking the transport seriously. Both the masters, who served as long as their vessels were necessary, well fulfilled these requirements. The master of the schooner, while responsible for the safety of his vessel, never failed to put her at the wharf at the site close to dangerous ledges whenever it could be accomplished. And this is a great fun fact that you can take home with you. In one instance, to take advantage of a very brief time when sea and tide permitted, one entire course of granite with 10 boxes of broken stone and sand, amounting to 170 tons, was discharged and delivered at the tower in 33 minutes. I doubt they could do today. The 15 to 40 men employed at the site, the superintendent, mechanics, and laborers were all good boatmen, each able to take care of himself in a dory in surf, in landing or leaving a ledge. This is great, this is my favorite line. A man who was slow, clumsy, or timid into a boat was not kept on employment. Work at the site commenced June 1st, 1903, to cut down the ledge for the foundation of the tower. The rock was very hard to work, and its planes of cleavage had so much dip, the use of blasting powder had to be sparing and with caution to avoid injury to the bed and its margin. This is believed to be Royal Luther of Malden, the architect, that guy in the hat there. The next picture is Frank Morse. He was the draftsman. And what I didn't know is at the time a draftsman did more than just draw. He actually did a lot of the design work. The picture was given to us by Mr. Morse's great-grandson. He found us on Facebook, and he shared this picture. And if you see the andirons at his fireplace at home, when he retired from the Lighthouse Service, they gave him those to keep his hearth warm. And they're from one of the lighthouse tenders. They're one of the brass fittings that were on the ship. And his sister still has them to this day. 2 strong 150-foot bulkheads were built to deflect the seas, and a temporary wharf was built with 20-horsepower hoisting engine and boiler, derrick, double tracks, and cars. They built all this temporary works just to get the granite into place. The laying of the first course of masonry commenced on August 11th. At the quarries in Rockport, With the advantages of expert labor and perfected labor-saving machinery, every stone was set and fitted between those below, above, and flanking it, just as it was to go in the tower. So this shot is a shot from Rockport, right at the quarry, and they proved that everything fit by putting it all together and then boxing it up and sending it out. Another kind of interesting thing was that every 4 or 5 courses, they were told to keep 1 block rough cut, not finished cut, from that particular part of the quarry. So in case a stone was broken, they would have a replacement that they could cut that would have the exact same color. That's how careful they were in making sure that the tower looked good, which you really couldn't see in our lifetimes. It was always covered with filth, remember? But we'll get to that. Quarters were built on the highest ledge of the graves, about 10 feet above the high water mark, and 90 feet southerly from the wharf, connected by an elevated walkway. The shanty contained quarters for the mess room, a kitchen, and storeroom for 30 men. Under the shanty, in chasms in the rock, were cold storage cellar and a blacksmith shop, which must have been awful working in there. By May 1905, erection of the watchroom and lantern commenced, and the interior rooms were finished by June. July saw the completion of the first order revolving lens, built in Paris and assembled on site. The apparatus, weighing 2 tons, floats on 400 pounds of mercury and makes 3 revolutions every 54 seconds. The mercury will come into play in the 1970s, so remember that. The fog signal is a Débal trumpet sounded by twin oil engines of 6 horsepower. A permanent wharf was built at the tower, protected by about 2,000 tons of heavy riprap, and a granite oil house was built on the highest point of the ledge, about 90 feet southerly from the tower, connected with the wharf by an elevated walk on iron posts sunk in the ledge. An interesting thing about the oil house was that they came in under budget. Is everybody paying attention? Federal government came in under budget, and so they built the oil house as a little extra. They didn't want to give the money back, so nothing's changed there. So we were able to contact a woman down in Washington, D.C., who is a researcher just for lighthouse-related topics, and she knows where to dig. And if you ever want to get something found, hire a researcher, because they know where to go. And she came back with 1,500 pages of documents that took my mom about 2 months to read. And she did. And she highlighted all the interesting stuff, because most of the days it was calm seas or rain or just really boring things. And then every now and then 4 German sailors show up in a spy boat or something. So there's a little exciting thing. So I'm going to spare you the 1,500 pages, and I'll just tell you a couple of the choice things. And these are actual keeper stories. And the reason why it's so exciting to be here with you guys is that the first keeper, Elliot Hadley, was from Winthrop. And his son, Elliot Hadley Jr., obviously was from Winthrop as well. And so those 2 guys could row from Winthrop out to the Lighthouse, do their 2-week shift, and then row back. Yeah, in all weather. So the light was first lit on September 1st, 1905.
Not go too far ahead here.
No, I think we're okay. This is a great shot. That's a lighthouse tender that was arriving with supplies the year it was built. And a lot of lighthouse tenders were left over from the Great White Fleet that Teddy Roosevelt had back about 10 years before. So a lot of retired boats from that. In 1907, this is from 1907, the U.S. lighthouse tender Myrtle makes deliveries. She fills the cistern with 1,500 gallons of fresh water, 100 gallons of mineral oil for the fog signal, 10 tons of coal. You can switch there, Lynn. There's the Myrtle. A nice shot from a fellow in Worcester that sells lighthouse-related stuff, and he found this picture of the Myrtle, and he lent it to me. You can go to the next slide. Oh, go back. We're not ready for her yet. 10 tons of coal, blankets, sheets, pillowcases, and nail, beef, and onions. All the materials were hauled in using block and tackle. So next slide. We have a very interesting young lady. Her name is Rose Pittenoff. And this is a story from the Boston Globe that was corroborated in some of the lighthouse records that we had from the keeper at the time. wish they had a housekeeper. In 1907, 19-year-old Rose Pittenoff from Dorchester, she gave a lively and colorful account of the swim from the Boston Globe. Miss Pittenoff made it alone and through the waters described as littered with flotsam and grease. Hundreds of people on their way to work stopped at Charlestown Bridge to cheer. The ferry boat Hugh O'Brien slowed by Lewis Wharf to allow her to pass. The crews of Fireboat 81, the steamer Bunker Hill, and other vessels sent up ringing cheers. 2 torpedo boats swerved from their course to prevent giving the girl their splash. As she turned near her destination at Boston Light, she abruptly turned left and made for Graves Light, which is, you know the area, right? That's crazy. The porpoises joined Miss Pittenoff between Green Island and the Graves, and they lost interest in the plucky swimmer after a while. Then an unusually large school of mackerel threatened to hold up the girl, but she managed to put on an extra burst of speed and just succeeded in getting clear of the first slacking tide between the Roaring Bulls and the Graves. When she reached the Graves, Rose did an about-face and headed back to Charlestown. But she was pulled from the water from her brother rowing beside her. But she became a very famous swimmer. She tried to swim the English Channel, but didn't make it, but lived to be a right old age and had kids and a great life. In 1910, Keeper Elliot C. Hadley, which I mentioned, reports shelling from artillery practice by nearby Fort Strong. Breaking waves don't shake the tower, he said, even though they come 3/4 up the side of the tower. The only vibration it gets is from heavy firing at the forts, once when the gun goes off, and again when the shot strikes. Good-sized gun. The minute that begins, we have to open all the doors and windows. And the way we found out first was by having all of our dishes broken. And speaking of broken dishes, I have here a whole pile of broken dishes that we found diving in the cove outside of Graves, and they all bear the emblem of the U.S. Lighthouse service. So it's kind of a neat relic, not really worth money, but just kind of fun, just because it's part of the story. On December 1916, this is a great story, and this story comes to us from a guy in Oregon who found us on Facebook about 2 weeks ago. So I've been telling you that we've just been adding to this. It's funny how things just keep coming. So this fellow's grandson wrote to me, and I called him and got some details. But on December 1916, First Assistant Harry Wynn had been alone on station for 70 days without relief due to bad weather and reduced to eating fish and smoking tea leaves and rope in his pipe. He told Edward Grosnow, anybody heard of Edward Grosnow? Oh, yeah. That was a soft pitch. He told Edward Grosnow the wind must have reached more than 100 miles an hour. It turned to snow, then sleet, then rain again, and then fog, and then snow, and then sleet, and then rain and fog again. The engines had to run day and night, even though you couldn't see the light 100 yards from the station. The water pump that cooled the engines kept freezing since it was located down on the wharf. I had to climb the 40-foot ladder up and down to thaw out that pump. That lasted for 5 days and nights. On Christmas Eve, I lowered the station boat on the ice and pushed her into open water, headed for Nahant Rock and provisions. My boat developed a leak. I started bailing with my cap in one hand and a tomato soup can in the other. I got some supplies and tobacco in Nahant, and they all got wet on my return trip. I had to dump it all out. It took me 5 hours to row back to the Graves. The head keeper arrived on a relief boat the very next day when it calmed down, and Harry Wynn promptly resigned to become a truck driver. So the early logbooks reveal most days were spent painting, cleaning, and maintaining the equipment. The enormous 9-foot-tall Fresnel lens was so big, they had to use a ladder to clean the inside of it. This is the only picture we have inside the lens. The keepers had loved to receive guests who often brought fruit or a newspaper in exchange for a tour. Hint, hint. In the early days of the U.S. Lighthouse service, up until 1939, men worked 2 weeks on station and 2 weeks off. And they went ashore on leave for 2 weeks. The head keeper was paid $1,100 a year. Assistants were paid half of that. Poor Harry Wynn, making $5.50 a year, smoking tea. Assistants half of that, and they had to buy their own uniforms. Food was provided, and the men often caught fish and lobsters off the ledges. The Lighthouse service had a traveling library program by which the men could order books. The books were packed in specially made crates and delivered along with other provisions. In spite of this, the Graves was a lonely place, but things improved in 1914 when the government ran an undersea telephone cable, chiefly to signal for German submarine activity. Eventually, the men received a radio and then, of course, a television. The U.S. Lighthouse service was dissolved into the Coast Guard in 1939, and many of the men switched uniforms and continued their careers. The shifts changed to 21 days on station and 7 days off. We received a call from a pair of retired Coast Guardsmen, Jack Philippi and Eugene Kalman, who worked at the Graves in 1952, and they're still friends today. They're 18 years old at the time. Red Sox games were the main entertainment, but their TV was always out for repairs. When it finally came back from the shop, as they were hoisting it up to the first floor, a gust of wind caught it and smashed it against the tower. So they had to use the radio after that. Another favorite pastime was looking at the girls on Revere Beach with their 3-foot telescope. Now, I don't know if you've ever looked at graves with a telescope, but there's not going to be a lot of detail there to see from about 6 miles, would you say? But they probably had a good imagination since they were 18-year-old. They received their provisions from the life station in Hull, and they could buy extra food at a little store there at the wharf. Fresh water was stored in a cistern in the floor, and they cooked their meals on an old kerosene stove. There was no shower or toilet, just a bucket fitted with a toilet seat. The Christmas holiday was always rough on the men in offshore lighthouses, and the Friends of Flying Santa was started in 1929 by Captain Bill Winkapaw, followed by his son Bill Jr., and of course Edward Rowe Snow. Well, that's a subject best detailed in a full-length presentation. We're fortunate to have in our archives this wonderful picture and rare view taken in 1937 from an observation plane of the Flying Santa himself over the Graves. Speaking of Edward Rowe Snow, it's fair to say the Graves was one of his favorite lighthouses of all time and one of the closest to his home here in Winthrop. Snow made some good friends with the keepers out at Graves who supplied him with countless stories, several of which we're sharing tonight. By the mid-1970s, technology had advanced enough to replace people with machinery, and Graves Light, like so many others, was gutted and stripped of its beautiful appointments and automated. And that mercury bath that spun the light sprang a leak, and that spelled the end of that big lens. The great days of the Crab Lighthouse keepers were over. We were approached by Ron Fiore, a retired Coast Guard engineer who oversaw the dismantling of the Great Fresnel lens, and he devised a clever system of lowering it intact to the dock. The lens was transported to Washington, D.C. for display at the Smithsonian. But we don't find any record that they actually did display it. They just put it in a crate, and that's where it's sat ever since. And so after almost 40 years of automation, the Graves received only a periodic maintenance visit from the Coast Guard. That's one of the Coast Guardsmen fixing the lens, or just fixing the batteries and doing a maintenance check. They realized they couldn't afford to maintain the Graves, and in accordance with established procedure, they offered it free to all surrounding municipalities. None were interested, so the lighthouse was offered up free to any nonprofit. Again, there were no takers. By law, it was to be disposed of by government auction, which is where the Waller family comes in. And that's the historical part of our presentation. So there's a folder right below that link that has pictures of the renovation, because I'm sure everybody's interested in what we've done with it and what we intend to do with it. Always some good sunrise pictures from the beach here. So we weren't quite sure what to do with it because we hadn't bought any lighthouses before, but we figured the first thing to do would be to make it tight and make sure that the rain came out. So these are the guys from Boston Scuba loading up a little boat and heading out early in the morning, every morning last summer. Here's Cat and Pat. And here's a couple of guys that are smiling. They're smiling heading out. I don't know if they were smiling coming back. They were the sandblasters, and they went inside that thing for days and blasted the daylights out of all the rusty metal. This guy's called the Beach Master, and we didn't name him. I think the lobstermen named him that. He's a gray seal. All the other seals seem to be harbor seals, and he just kind of keeps charge. He's been out there about 18 years and keeps an eye on all the other seals, so he's the boss. So if you go out there, make sure you respect the beach master. This is what it looked like when we bought it. Kind of messy. Lots of rust everywhere, lots of layers of paint. There they are sandblasting. Here's a tip, don't do it yourself, the sandblasting, the tire guy. That's kind of a little before and after there for the sandblasting. But it all cleaned up pretty nice. And then we painted it. There's Rick. And that's how it turned out. The stone was cleaned, and these guys here, the next slide, they found some rusty metal and they're happy about that. These are the two masons, and they spent the entire summer on a basket hanging off the end of graves working on it. There's our scrap metal pile that we took to the scrap yard. And there was also a few hundred gallons of waste oil that the Coast Guard left for us at no charge. So we had to haul it up in buckets and then take it offshore and bring it to a recycling center.
It was in that cistern.
Yeah. And we found some pieces of glass from the lantern that were inside that oil house, and we couldn't figure out how to get them out, so we built this little pulley system and a little rack, and we haul them all out and we have them at home in case any of the lantern glass breaks. It's curved, diamond-shaped glass. I don't know where you could get it made. This is the floor that we busted up. Actually, Carl, you did that one, didn't you? Yep. Thank you, Carl. And just some of the rubble that we hauled out. It's really hard to move material in and out of the place, as you can imagine. The dock has been a real godsend as far as staging materials and so forth, and it's also great for picnics and porta potties.
Did you build the pier?
No, the pier was there. Yeah. Here's another fully laden boat headed out. Yep, just grinding out the mortar. They said in some places it had receded about a foot deep into the stone, so they had to dig it right out. Yeah, that's a pretty nasty job. Of course, you have to wait for the tide, for the lower stuff, right? And there were some broken pieces, but we found them in the surf underneath. And here's Mike putting that one back. We put it in with stainless steel pins and epoxy. So when you go out, we go from the boat and we row in. You can't get a boat that close because of the rocks. Here we had a barge come out and clear some of the stones that had fallen into the cove from that riprap that we were talking about. And kind of an eerie day. It was kind of fun.
Now, what are they clearing?
There was a riprap stone breakwater that over the decades had fallen into the cove. So big stones, bigger than this table, had fallen in. And so they cleared them out with that clamshell and put them back. And then, of course, last winter came and threw them all back into the cove again. So we're not doing that anymore. That was a good idea. Here's my son working on some little improvements to one of the top floors that's going to be our kitchen. The room where the pedestal that rotated the lens had no windows in it because it just wasn't a place that they would hang out. But it's the room with the walkway that goes all around at the top, right? And Lynn said, this would be the best room for the kitchen, but it has no windows. So we went to his high school shop, and they had a big rolling device, and we bought some bronze and rolled it. And here we are at our shop at home, turning it into these sleeves. And we got some portholes at a marine auction. And we welded them to the sleeves, and then we take a break, and we're looking at the boat. There we go. We cut holes in the top floor and welded those right to the outside of the tower. And so now we have these portholes all the way around. We can look out. And there are several lighthouses we've noticed that have had that. We've been in many that they did that. They just didn't do that at graves. So there's a departure from the historical part, but you don't really notice it from the water, and it really makes that room quite livable now. There's Carl. He's putting the windows in. They used glass blocks in the 70s. They tore out the old windows and they put in these glass blocks that you couldn't see through, and they didn't allow for any ventilation. And then they neatly took the old windows out and they stacked them up in the corner, so we knew exactly what the old windows looked like. So Carl took some back to his shop in Nantucket and rebuilt a whole set for the entire building, which was tricky. And Carl, how much differently sized were those openings?
They're only about a half inch at the most different, all of them.
Yeah.
So
Isn't that amazing?
Pretty close.
The stonemasons really knew what they were doing.
The waves never get up that high to affect the windows?
They do, yeah. The waves have come up, solid waters come up 60 feet, and sprays come up all the way over the top. So Carl built storm shutters to go outside these. So in the winter, we pull those closed, and there's marine plywood shutters to protect the glass. Here's, yeah. These are some surrounds. One of the carpenters that was working with Carl noticed that there was some paint, and there was just a little, you know how there's always evidence in an old building of what might have been there? And he realized that the windows had this oak paneling around them. So next slide, Carl rebuilt this with quarter sawn oak sills and oak paneling all the way around. They're just stunning, really beautiful. Here we are tearing up the floor and putting in a new wood floor. All the floors were quarter sawn oak, and we were able to save, I think, 3 floors maybe. And we got some used antique wood and had it milled up into flooring to match, and we did the rest of the floor. So they're all quite nice, sanded down. There's the gang. We woke up to a regatta from, I guess, Marblehead that must have come by quietly in the night, and it was kind of fun having all those boats out there. Just hauling stuff up. There's one of our painting crews. We had a bunch of painting parties. A lot of people, friends wanted to help, but some of the stuff's kind of specialized. But everybody can paint, so some better than others, I'll tell you. But so we bring beer and sandwiches and so forth and help people out, and everybody had a good time. Some people even came back more than once. It's amazing. There's so much to paint. It's just various happy crews.
Is it special paint, David?
It is. It's a 2-part epoxy. So there's 6 coats, 6 parts of paint to do it. It's what they use for oil rigs and ships and so forth. It's expensive, but why would you use cheap paint, you know? You don't want to do it every
2
year.
coats of primer and a top coat.
Yeah. There's my brother getting way up there. And here's the tower all cleaned, and I don't think anybody in this room is alive and remembers it as clean as this, because back in the day they were always using coal for ships, and there was quite a lot of soot in the atmosphere, and that acquired that kind of neat-looking dirt. But once we started cleaning the mortar joints, there were these clean patches, because as the guys were working, and it started looking like a real patchwork, so we decided to just clean the whole thing. The to-do list. Yeah, one of them.
Break down garbage, the last one.
So we cleaned the walls, and they're all beautiful tile. They're slightly curved to make the tile. There's the first beginning, and then after. So it's real clean. All the interior surfaces are nice, and floors, ceilings, and walls. This is some of the rust. Actually, when metal rusts, it has the force of 3,000 pounds per square inch, so it can even split stone. And that's what it was doing there. So we had the masons come back last year, and bust out the bricks around the beams, blast the beams inside the pockets, and then put the bricks back. Which was a lot of very meticulous work. They did a fantastic job. Thumbs up. And so here's Carl building what's very exciting. One of the ceilings in the top floor is made of oak, and it was rotted and really messed up, and it wasn't worth trying to patch back together. So we left it as it was, kept it in place, and then Carl built a copy and fitted it right underneath it. So here he is putting that together in his yard. It's absolutely, it looks like a shed. It's just absolutely stunning. And here we are towing out the brand new ladder. Every year we seem to lose the ladder off the dock. It gets torn off by the storm. So here's a fresh one. And this one we actually took down this season, and now it's not going to get taken away. All the cross bracing was falling apart. So I went to American Nut and Bolt in Chelsea and had new cross bracing made, and we put that in this year just to keep the dock there, because that dock is such a big amenity for us. Here we are blasting and painting the pilings. And then there's up top at the lantern, we're taking out the glass and recaulking it, shining all the brass up, and then putting it back together. Very slow work, that is. Here's a little desk we made. I modified an old roll-top desk with a busted top and built a curved top and put that in. Here we are. There's the mechanism to spin the weight with the 2-ton lens. There was a 300-pound weight that would spin it, like almost like a clock mechanism. And some of the parts were still there, so we shined them up and polished them, and then we put them back up in the ceiling. Here's my son putting brass polish on. Very specialized pieces you can't buy on eBay, you know. This is the looking up from what's going to be the kitchen up into the lantern room, and we're taking great care. And these are little skylights. The lens would fill this whole space if it were still there. And this is a walkway with these little glass skylights, and a lot of them are broken. So Carl found somebody on Nantucket that works in glass, and they built a little mold and they cast new ones. And there they are. We made them in kind of some fun colors to remind us of sea glass. And then we're putting them back into the bronze pieces there. Here's some bunk beds going in. And some brass rails for the bunk beds. Some kids doing what they're doing. They're checking their phones. And Carl built new handrails. The neat thing about the place was that there was one handrail that was still there from the original. There was one door that was still from the original. There was one newel post. So from those, he made exact copies. And I have no idea how he did these, because the curves are strange. For the handrail brackets, we couldn't find them, and I went everywhere to try to find them. So I found a foundry in Somerville, Mystic Foundry, and they cast them for me for $5 a piece. Yeah. These are copies of the door. There's the original door. And it's funny, we didn't know what kind of doorknobs it had, because if they're not there, you don't know. And a diver found a doorknob in the cove and gave it to me. It was a porcelain doorknob, so we found some old antique porcelain knobs and fitted them out. And there you go. That's the restoration photos. Does anybody have any questions?
What's next? What's next? What are you going to do with the day?
Well, we're going to button it up for the winter. We're going out tomorrow morning at 8, and we're going to caulk the windows again, probably put another coat of paint on the shutters, make sure everything's weather stripped. Everything on the dock is bolted down right to the dock, and then we're just going to start working on the kitchen cabinets. So Carl has the full set of plans. They're going to be made of mahogany and brass, upper cabinets with curved glass and lower cabinets. We're going to kind of have to make a lot of the appliances because you can't buy curved stoves and so forth. So we'll probably just grind away at that in the wintertime. And then we have some guys that have helped us figure out how to do the plumbing, the water, the power and all that. And so when the budget allows, we have it all spec'd out and we'll just get going on that. Yes?
Is there any, do you know of any treasure out there from any sunken ship?
Yes, there's tons of treasure out there.
Well, I knew there was a ship with a lot of platinum on it.
Well, I don't think I would talk about it. There is one ship, the zoo ship, which sank full of animals. You probably know about the city of Salisbury. But they got all the animals off except for a couple of monkeys. And one, they found a monkey skeleton on Green Island about 20 years later. And a guy called me up, whose grandfather actually found it. And the other monkey swam to Deer Island, to the penitentiary there, and broke in. Which, I don't know, you know.
Nice pen. Yeah, how stable is the temperature inside the lighthouse itself during various times of year?
It's slow to cool down, and then it stays cold when it's cold. But it's always cooler, 10 degrees cooler out there than, say, here. Yes?
What has been the cost so far?
Oh, boy. I haven't tallied it up yet, but it's a lot. But it's less than a comparable house on the ocean would cost. Yes?
What was it like sort of deciding between like restoration and historical preservation and some of the changes you made? How did you go through that process?
Oh, that's the most painful process. I'm glad you brought that up because it's been really hard to say, it's pretty easy to tell what the historical thing to do is, but do you really want to go to the bathroom in a bucket and throw it off the dock every day? Like at some point you have to say, this isn't a museum, and so it's a back and forth. Lynn and I talk about it constantly. And we're trying to do things that are sensitive that you'd go, well, I know that wasn't like that. They didn't have a really nice kitchen. But it's nautical themed and it's made from the same materials as the rest of the place, and it fits. It doesn't look like it's out of place.
It honors the
Yeah. Yes?
So this could be your summer place, for example, for your family.
That's the idea, yeah.
That's the idea.
Yeah. But we've had a lot of tours. We've had, it's been an auction item for charity auctions. It's in its, I think, 4th charity auction right now. The folks at the Constitution Museum are auctioning it off next week, I think. So that's raised about $15,000 or $20,000 for different charities so far. So you can do cool things with it, Yes?
Do you have sort of agency oversight on this? You talked about on one of the lists removing the garbage and debris and what have you. So the removal of any unnecessary stuff could be an issue. And then you also have to meet, DEP or any other, harbor guidelines for anywhere around the site itself.
Oh yeah, we've had DEP out there. We've had the Boston Harbor Police. We always invite them. We always call them and say, what's the right thing to do? They are aware of what we're doing. The Coast Guard, we clear everything with them. The Army Corps of Engineers, we have to clear it with them. The Mass Historical Commission, we have to clear it with them. I'm sure we're going to upset somebody. There's no book, there's no checklist, So at some point, you talk to 7 agencies, and you're like, all right, I'm just going to do it, and then see somebody else. Yes.
When you seal it up for the winter, and you said you were going to take the outside ladder down, where are you going to put that?
We tied it down to the dock, so it's flat up on the dock.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I'm sick of losing those things. Yes?
Do you have an obligation to keep the light going?
That's the Coast Guard, and so they have a set of keys, and they can maintain it. They can come and go as they please in the fog and wine. But they always call ahead of time. They're nice. They're good guys. They're like firefighters. They love their job, and they always, they come at a certain period of time. It doesn't take that much maintenance for them, but we're not allowed to obscure it in any way. Matter of fact, Lynn and I were out there camping a few weeks ago, and having a glass of wine and sitting outside, and the sun's gone down, and this boat comes up, and I'm like, hey, it looks like it's kind of headed our way, which is weird at night. And this big floodlight comes on, and I'm like, looks like the Coast Guard, because they don't travel light, they got good-sized boats. And I realized that we had a floodlight that we had been using to work, and it was inside the lantern, and it just looked different. I think from a distance, it didn't look like graves, so they just came to kind of say what the hell's going on, so we turned it off. Yes?
I saw you on the brief short on this old house.
Oh, yeah.
Are you planning to do anything more with them, or any type of special or anything?
I invited them back, and they said they'd come, but they haven't yet. I don't think, they were going to look at it to do a whole show, a whole season on, but when they got out there, they realized it's so hard to ferry a crew out every day that the cost would just go way, way up. So they just did a little special, and I think they might do another one someday. It was nice to have them. Yes?
Do you have any plans to build any structures outside the lighthouse, like the original?
Well, the bridge that went from the dock to the oil house, that was torn down in the blizzard of '78, I think. It took it. It's been taken out in a few storms, but that's the latest one. And it would be fun to put that back. And there was like a little pavilion on the dock as well. So I think we could probably do that with Mass Historical and they'd be fine. But I don't think we could build like anything crazy that was completely different. Plus, I don't think it would last out there. It's rough.
How big is the I guess the old oil storage building? How big is that?
It's 8 by 8 feet on the inside.
So it's small.
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
It's and there's no windows, so it would be a good place to put somebody that you didn't like. But yeah, time out room. Or you could keep your platinum bars in there. Oh, Jesus! I got it away. Yes.
Just an equation for, now you're a lighthouse owner, right?
Yes.
And you own a home out in the water.
Yeah.
I mean, so is your deed encompass, all of the rocks and everything else? And, do you pay taxes to, Boston?
Well, it's funny you mention that because the deed said that it was an 11-acre parcel. And, that's
At
real
low
estate
tide?
talk, okay? So, yeah, even at low tide, I think that's a push. So I'm not sure what the exact acreage is, but it's not really mowable. There's really not any property that's usable other than if you're a bird and you just want to take a crap. Then it's a really great place. But it's actually really hard to get on those rocks, and people are always trying and falling and scraping themselves, and those cuts just never heal. It's like you try it once and then you're like, forget it. There's nothing to see.
Good deterrent for visitors.
There's a few people's initials carved into them in places. It's kind of fun.
But where was the government property? Is it now yours solely, or are you beholden to the city of Boston, or,
We're beholden to the Coast Guard to maintain the structure so that they can maintain the light. But it's outside of the city of Boston. It's, I don't know, it's outside the map of Boston. It never was.
No taxes?
No. But it's you know what it was a pile of rocks that didn't even barely had a name that ships hated, and so I don't think anybody ever claimed it.
Sell it to the Chinese,
That's a great idea. I never thought of that. Yes?
Dave, again, how thick are the walls of the lighthouse?
They're 7 feet thick on the first floor, and then the rooms don't get smaller as you go up. It's a cylinder inside, which kind of screwed with my head, because I was expecting them to get narrower, but it's just the outside that gets narrower. So they're only about 2.5 feet thick at the top. And we had an engineer come out and told me that it's built that way for weight to ballast it so it doesn't fall over. So the first 40 feet is solid stone and bigger around, and that way it doesn't tip over. You don't think of something like that as tipping over, but it could. And then that flare at the top is not ornamental. That's to keep the waves off the lantern above it. So that pushes like the bow of the ship kind of pushes the water away. Yes?
What happened with the German spies?
Oh, they called the Navy, and the Navy came and got them. And I don't know what happened to them after that.
They were the monkeys?
Yeah, exactly. Wait, which monkey? It's in the back.
After the storm of last winter, did you ever get water inside
We put some buckets in an area that was leaking a little bit, and when we came in the spring, there was no water in them. So I guess we did a good job tightening it up. That's what Carl's gonna, and his guys are gonna help with tomorrow, is make sure that it's tight this year. Because once water gets in, you know what it can do.
Where was it leaking in? From the very top?
From the lantern up above there, yeah. It's a lot of glass and glazing. Yes?
Where'd you find Carl?
That's a good question. He married my wife's sister. And I don't know where she found it.
But he hadn't done anything like this before, was he?
He's never done a lighthouse before, but, you know, that didn't stop him from being at the head of the list, because he said he would. He said he could, so, and he did. He's the only one. I was an expert. Yes?
You want to introduce your co-workers?
Absolutely. Is
Dave?
Carl, can you take a bow in the back there, Carl?